Hey, welcome back to this series where we have been learning how to build web applications with AI. In the previous videos, we mostly just got things to a place where they were working to generate AI text responses and generate AI images. However, those approaches pretty much focus on just following the happy path. In this video, we're going to talk about getting our application more production ready by accounting for what happens when things don't follow the happy path and when users are potentially malicious. So we'll look at accounting for error handling as well as security concerns. Okay, the first thing I want to fix is this weird error message. And this is pretty much coming because we have inside of our app this dialog element that has inside of it an image that doesn't really have a source attribute. So I think this is the result of Qwik trying to figure out some information about that image. So what we can do is basically fix it so that we don't actually show this image. Right now we're showing it, we're including it if the image state is not loading, which is the default behavior. So I think what we can actually do is just say, if it's not loading and we have the image state.url. So if that URL is set, and there we go, that fixed that problem. Next, we'll kind of go from top to bottom and see what sort of things we can fix. So one thing that I noticed was no one mentioned to me that I had a typo here. So I had the same label for the two opponents. That's probably why we had an issue with our prompt before and had to add this extra line. But you know, you live and learn. I also have another little bug that I need to fix down in this streaming response where we are essentially checking to close the stream on if the payload here equals done, but then because of the logic here, we're continuing to parse the next section of code. So I just need to add an else statement and only include the next logic, the next bit of logic that would happen otherwise. And the match will still have to run. So you can either move this to the top and then exit out of the loop inside of this condition, or you can use an if else. Either way would work. But now we're at least accounting for the two different paths that the logic can take if we are done or if we need to continue. The next part that I want to work on is down inside of the template, we have a couple of these little red squigglies where Qwik is basically yelling at us because we are passing in a function that takes a standard submit event and it's looking for more of a quick submit event. So we're going to fix these. Essentially, because we've added types for traditional or default submit events, this is an issue because as we remember, the Qwik event handler system requires sort of a special syntax for it, and it's not actually dealing with real browser events. It's dealing with its own sort of Qwik kind of synthetic ones. So easy fix, we just make that a quick submit event. Whoops. A quick submit event, which we have to import from the library so that the type is available. And once we have that, then we can see that our submit handler is fixed. And we have another issue for the image generation. So on submit image, same problem, same fix. Beautiful. No more red squigglies. And that settles all of the red squigglies I'm going to work on. We have one here that's just from this is a mistake. It's from a extension that is detecting a false positive. And then we have two here that say value does not exist on event target. But in this case, because it's going to be an input event, it always will. And I'm just going to ignore those for now. The only other red squigglies in this project I think are safe to ignore. So that makes me happy. That is okay, that should work. That is okay, that should work. Here we have response bodies possibly null. That is a legitimate problem that we're going to come back to. And then we have two more here where form data is of type unknown. Of course, I know what the type is. We could add a type definition to fix that if we want. But I think I'm just going to skip that. So we'll check the browser. It looks like everything still works. A little bit of a layout shift, but that's not really an issue. And we can test that the app still works. A cat and a dog. And you can tell me There you go. Dogs win. How about we check out the image? Okay, pretty aggressive. I guess that works. So we've done a bit of cleanup work, but the next thing we have to do is actually address problems like this one. So far, we've been building the app following the happy path, assuming everything's going to go as expected, but in reality, things can go a little haywire sometimes. So let's start thinking about those cases. So in the case here where we have a response body that's possibly null, the question is, what would be the appropriate response to send as part of this larger onPost method? And I think the answer could just be as simple as respond with an empty string. Now, if we're going to do that though, it doesn't make sense for us to be working inside of a readable stream. So I think what makes more sense is to pull out some of the logic in this HTTP request so that it's no longer inside of this start function, but happens before we even construct the stream, such that if we need to do any sort of exit early, we can do that before we even construct the stream. And only in the case of the happy path do we actually construct the stream and start streaming the response. So all of this stuff can actually come up before the stream constructor. And then we'll go ahead and leave the actual streaming logic in here for when we know that we're going to create the readable stream. So all that logic we copied or cut, we can paste right above. We can do some proper formatting. Okay. And now this should still work. So what we can do above here is we're still dealing with this, the body could possibly be null, but we can do a check here and say if there is not a response.body, then we can basically return early. Now we also want to send some sort of response, so I'm gonna copy this guy and probably just paste it there. And in fact, I'm going to go ahead and skip using the response constructor because we can just send an empty string is fine. We'll say 200 and just an empty string. I think that should technically account for this issue because this logic would fire in the case that that was null. We would send the empty string back and then we would stop processing this function before we even get to the stream and then start the controller. So this is probably pretty safe to just ignore. Okay, and I don't know why I'm putting it here and not on these other red squigglies, but that's fine. Another case we want to account for is what happens when we have an invalid request. For example, if we get something back from the API that says, hey, we did something wrong, like forgetting our API token. Let's see what happens here. I'm just going to go ahead and submit this. Cat, a dog. And as we can see, this network request just hangs on for a really long time. We don't get anything back, and we don't get any sort of message that something went wrong, not even in the terminal. And I'll just give you a hint that the problem is that OpenAI is responding with a body that's basically saying, hey, you forgot your API token. But because we have a body, this logic continues, which means we get to the stream, and then the stream doesn't really know what to do with the reader because there is none. We're getting a JSON response. So let's look into that as well. We can basically do a check and say if not response.OK, so that's going to be the status that an HTTP request will come back with if the response succeeded or not. And then we can do some logic here. So we can have another early return, and then we can say, we can do something like a console log await response.json. So let's see what we get here. Once again, we'll do a cat and a dog and submit that. And now we are getting a response right away because we've returned early. And we can see that the message that we get, or the body of the response, is this error message. You didn't provide your API key. So you may want to provide a few different cases or a few different ways to handle a bad response, maybe based on the status code or whatever. But in my case, for this, just to keep it simple, I'm going to continue logging the response so that our backend can see what happened when the response failed. But we're also going to return something to the user or to the client. So we'll say request event dot send. And then in this case, instead of sending a 200, we can go ahead and just use the response status that was passed to us and the response status text. And this will give some sort of hint to the client about what went wrong. So let's do this one more time. A cat and a dog. And we can say, tell me. And now we are getting here in our response a 401 message of unauthorized. Of course, now this highlights another client-side issue, which is we are handling the failed request on the back end and sending a successful response with a bad status code. But on the client, we are not actually handling bad requests that could throw off our application. So we're going to do that where we actually submit the form, which is here, and very similar to what we had above. We can say if not response.ok, then we can do our logic and return early. So rather than spend too much time on figuring out what the logic is, I think I'm just going to do something simple and just alert the user with something like the response.status text. This is definitely something you're going to want to make a little bit more of a sophisticated solution, but again, it's going to be highly project specific. And I'd rather just call out that this is a step that should be done, but not necessarily go into the fine details of implementing it. But if we now look at our app, we can see on the not so happy path, user submits a cat and a dog. The backend is going to experience an HTTP error, which is going to forward to the front end or the client, which is going to receive that error and then communicate something to the user. Now, unauthorized, not super helpful, or maybe we can even, provide something more useful to the user. Say something like, the request experienced an issue. Yeah, again, maybe something more sophisticated based on the status code would be helpful and maybe have some sort of pop-up. But again, that's not something that I'm going to be focusing on today. So we can go back and fix that bug that we introduced. So that should now work. But now we're kind of playing around with another problem, and that is what happens when the user does something that they shouldn't do. For example, submitting this HTTP request without an opponent 1 or an opponent 2. And here's where we get into a topic of validation, where essentially we want to ensure that these fields are required. So we can do a number of things. First, on the client side, we can add some validation logic with using HTML validation attributes. So it's easy enough to come to these inputs and say, here and here, we're going to set these as required. But if we explore the front end, we can see that, in fact, these text areas are getting the required attribute, and we are seeing the style treatments that are included in my custom CSS styles to give a little different treatment for invalid forms. And also, we get some functionality where if we try and submit this form, we will see that there's an error message and it'll highlight the first invalid input. So that's all really handy, but we also have to remember that client-side validation is not enough, because after all, a tech-savvy user can get in and modify the HTML such that they remove those validation checks, and then once again, they could submit the form with invalid data. So we still have to provide the validation on the back end to make sure that invalid requests do not get submitted. For that, we're going to use a library that I really like called Zod. So npm install Zod. And then we can run dev again. And essentially what we want to check for is, well, let's first import the libraries. I think I'm going to import it here. Let's import from Zod. And we're going to import Z from Zod. And so what we need to do for validation is basically just ensure that opponent 1 and opponent 2 are defined and that they are strings. So with Zod, what we can do is define a validation schema and then check an input type against it. So in this case, our input data could be this form data. So we essentially are expecting form data to be an object that contains opponent 1 and opponent 2, which are required strings. So I'm going to say something like const validation equals, and then we'll define our Zod schema. We know it's supposed to be an object, and then we can define an object with properties like opponent1 colon, and then what opponent1 needs to do, or what needs to be in this schema, is a Zod string. So we said it has to be a string. By default, anything that we define is going to be required. So if it's undefined, that will be a problem. However, Zod treats empty strings as valid input. So we're probably going to want to put a min length on this one. And let's say minimum length has to be 1. That way we know it has to be defined. And then we can do the same thing for opponent 2. And once we have the schema, which is this guy here, we can actually call a method on it called safe parse. You can either do parse or safe parse. I like safe parse because if we just use parse, it's going to throw an exception here, and then we would probably have to have some sort of exception or try catch situation going on. So we're going to do a safe parse, which is basically going to take the input data that we want to validate against, and it will give us some validation information as a result of safe parse. So we'll have the schema, the safe parse method, pass in the input data, and we'll get out a validation object. And with that validation object, what we can do is say, if the validation is not successful, then we had an error. We know that the user tried to do something they were not allowed to do, for example, omitting one of these two inputs or passing an empty string for either one. So if it's in the case that it's not successful, we can once again return early from the execution of this function, and then we probably want to send some sort of response. So I can grab this guy just as an example, and we can send that sort of response. So we're just going to send an empty string for now. And what I want to do is here, I'm going to see what this validation object looks like. We're going to console log validation.error. And for everything else, we'll just leave that as is for now. We want to focus on this invalid data branch. So in order to allow for that, I'm going to come down here and just remove one of these required attributes so that we can submit it. And I'm going to give this, I'm going to set this up with some pre-filled out information. So a cat, just so that it's there. So now if we submit this, we'll see that the response comes back right away. We do have a little bit of a logic issue. I think I know what's going on here. If we, when we handle submit, well, yeah, one problem is on a bad response, we are still leaving the loading state as it was. So do have to remember to do that. And then I think the problem here is that we are not getting a bad response. We're getting a valid response, but we're not streaming that data. And I think that is okay for now because that's not how it's expected to work. So yeah, it's a bug on the client side, but that's not something that we should have to account for yet. Or I guess we can go ahead and here we can just say if there is state.winner, then we can add this logic. Okay. So only in the case that there is a winner will we actually find the winner input, and only in the case that we actually find the winner input will we actually do the confetti. So let's see, that should have fixed that. Tell me, yep, no problem. Good enough. That's not the bug that I was trying to solve. What we're talking about is this validation issue. So let's look at this error message really quick. We're seeing that we're getting a Zod error where the message says the string must contain at least one character. And that is for the path opponent1. That's because here, where we run our validation, we are passing in an object where this object contains the property opponent1, but it's an empty string, and that doesn't satisfy our minimum requirements. So rather than sending a 200 request, I think it makes more sense to send a 400 request that's basically telling the client, hey, you did something wrong. And then the next question is, what do we actually send as a result? So I think instead of sending text, in this case, it might make more sense to send some JSON. So we can send an object, and request event has this handy.json method that allows us to pass in some JSON object and makes it easier to set the proper response type. So then what should that error message be? Well, we can use this Zod error to construct an error object, basically. So this is another area where I think it would make a lot of sense to do something a little bit more polished. But for now, just because I want to show what the process might look like and not get too far into the details, what I'm just going to do is pass this array of error objects in the response that we send back and let the client sort of figure it out. So I'm going to say errors is going to equal this validation dot error object. Okay, so let's see when we submit that. I don't think I need to log that anymore. I think we've got that. And so let's see what we get back. We're going to submit that. Okay, the request experienced an issue. Okay, in the network, we get this 400 error, and we get an object that contains errors and issues. Oops, that was a mistake. That should actually only just be the error.issues. So error.issues. There we go. That's what I want. Okay, let's submit that one more time. Now on the back end, we're getting some responses that's sending a 400, hey, you did something wrong, and we're letting the client inside know, hey, you have some errors, here's the list, and then it's passing us the information that we got from Zod. So we've addressed validation issues if the user omits a required field or sends just an empty string, but we are not addressing an issue if a user sends too much information. And this can be kind of critical for a number of reasons. One, if we look at our template that we have up here, we are passing in the values of opponent 1 and opponent 2 directly into our prompt. And that can be an issue when you consider that the amount of text that we include in each prompt is going to affect how many tokens are consumed. So you could think that if you were an attacker, you might inject a lot of text in here just to use up a lot of extra tokens, which is going to ultimately affect the cost of using these AI services. So a decent first level of defense there is to just also include a max length. Now, the max is going to be highly subjective based on the application. I think in our case, we can probably do fine with 100 characters for both opponent 1 and opponent 2. And so now if we include everything but add in, I don't know, just a lot of text, then we can see that request experienced an issue. And in this case, we can see the string must contain at most 100 characters. Now that's great for the, once again, backend validation state. We can do a little bit nicer by giving the user some input on the client side before they try and submit that, by also adding a max length to our inputs. So where we have required, I'm also going to return this one to be required, and then we'll add a max length equal to 100. Now let's see how this looks. If I come in and I try to paste a bunch of text, lots of text, eventually the nice thing with the max length on the text area is even though I'm typing here, it's going to limit my my text to whatever the max length is. So automatically I have some sort of feedback from the UI as I'm typing these things to also assist with some of that user experience. Okay, so that covers your traditional validation as a role in security. But when we're talking about AI and these prompts, it actually overlaps closely with another topic around security that is kind of new to the industry with this whole AI and prompt movement, and that is prompt injection. There's an excellent article by Simon Wilson called Prompt Injection Attacks Against GPT-3. And it basically outlines a vulnerability in these AI chat models where, because we are taking whatever input a user wants into a text field and passing that almost directly into our AI prompts, it allows for bad actors to inject malicious text that could ultimately cause our AI models to behave in ways that we wouldn't want them to. For example, it could lead to prompt leakage in your AI responses where your AI technically tells the user what their sort of prompt, the full text of the prompt is. And that can be a problem, especially if you've spent a lot of time carefully crafting your prompt to give your app some sort of competitive edge. Or it can lead to something like hijacking, where users can subvert the purpose of the AI and get it to do something that it wasn't intended for. This may sound very similar to another type of attack called SQL injection, where attackers can manipulate your application to run some arbitrary SQL on the database, and this can lead to catastrophic issues. However, unlike SQL injection attacks, there doesn't currently seem to be a reliable way to protect against prompt injection, because after all of these prompts are entirely arbitrary text, where SQL has very specific keywords that can be escaped and sanitized, but prompts that you send to an AI API are much more flexible, making it nearly impossible to actually escape and sanitize that text. And that's why the recommended approach is to still treat user input as untrusted and try to avoid situations where users have unfettered access to inject whatever text they want into your prompts. So in our case, maybe 100 characters is a bit unnecessary or a bit more than necessary. And we may want to cap it to something like 60 characters. Okay, so with those protections in place, I'm going to reset my state of my inputs somewhere down. Nope, up. Where's the cat? There it is. Get rid of that. And I'm just going to do a little bit of cleanup by, I think, moving this function out of this file into my utils, because why not? We'll export function. There we go. This is now a JavaScript file, so this needs to be, oops, param HTML form element. Great, we don't need that. And this guy can now go here. There we go. That looks good. Now we need to come back and bring it in here. Let's go JS form submit. That is enough to import it. And now we're using it. Should have been imported from utils. There we go. Great. So I think that's going to cover everything. We have our template. We have our business logic and validation for our text generator. We've added some not happy path logic and error handling, fixed a couple of bugs, and added some not happy path error handling on the client side as well. And I think that is all that we really had to do. Yeah, looks good. And I think let's just double check that it's still working. So who would win in a fight between a llama and an alpaca? All right, looks like alpacas take this round, and let's see what this looks like. That is a pretty epic battle. Looks more like a sheep to me, but hey, you know, AI art is open to interpretation, right? Okay, we caught and fixed a lot of bugs. We accounted for what happens when things could experience an error, and we also added some safeguards to protect our application against bad actors, and particularly learned about things like prompt injection. At this point, the last step is getting our application from our local machine onto the internet so that people can actually use it. So that's what we're going to be focusing on in the next video. So be sure to subscribe if you want to be notified when that video comes out. Also, don't forget, if you have a question, throw it in the comments. If you have a concern, throw it in the comments. If you just want to say, hey, throw it in the comments. And if you have a weird rash that you're kind of concerned about, go see a doctor. Okay, thanks, bye.